Everybody, all the participants, we're gonna, I'll introduce our panelists and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But my name's Brett Brewer, and most importantly, thanks for joining today. This is our first edition of Crosscut Conversation. Today's topic is leading startups through an economic crisis. We've assembled a truly all-star cast of LA tech legends, as you can see there on the top of your screen. Due to COVID-19, as we know, almost all the world's economies are effectively shut down. And we've never been through anything like this before. But before we go any further on the business front, I do want to stop and acknowledge all of the frontline workers, both in the US and around the world, that are working very hard, putting their lives at stake to keep this pandemic in check. On the business side, even though we've never been through anything exactly like this before, it is very reminiscent of both the dot-com crash in 2000, as well as the global financial crisis in October of 2008. Our goal for this conference is to have our panelists share their experiences through those previous two crises, and hopefully our audience to be able to pull out some words of wisdom that can be applied today. I do want to start with an overall positive about the LA tech community specifically, and that is that it's a family, and it's always been a family. If you think back to the dot-com crash in 2000, it was a bad situation. But the companies that survived, PriceGrabber and Shopzilla and Lower My Bills, Intermix Media and many others, did so in large part because we stuck together. We regularly had CEO conference calls sharing notes about what VCs were open for business and willing to invest in LA companies. We shared strategies for cutting costs and more. This helped us all survive and eventually thrive. Literally almost 20 years later to the day, we are, of course, going through something very similar again. And what I've seen here at Crosscut with our Crosscut portfolios is a lot of those same examples. Companies helping each other with their PPP applications, sharing resources and figuring out a way to cut costs, and even sharing displaced talent, lists around displaced talent. This is a uniquely LA tech quality that should not be taken for granted. With that in mind, I'd now like to introduce our amazing panel. We've got Jake Winebaum, Kara Nortman, Chuck Davis, and Sky Dayton. We're going to start with Jake. Jake, as many of you know, began building companies here in Los Angeles in the 90s. He was the first leader of Disney's early internet ventures, eventually co-founded eCompanies with our other panelist, Sky Dayton. And all that happened just before the original dot-com crash. eCompanies launched 9 companies, by the way, including Jamdat, Boingo, Business.com, as well as funding Lower My Bills. Say hello to Matt Coffin out there on the East Coast. These companies not only survived the crash, but created nearly $2 billion in IPO and M&A exit. Most recently, Jake founded Brighter at the tail end of the last recession and sold it to Signia last year. So without further ado, Jake, I'll turn the microphone over to you so you can share your story.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Brett. I have survived 4 recessions in my career, but I do think today I'm going to focus on the dot-com crash because there are some really eerie parallels between that period, 1999 and 2000, and 2019 and 2020. As you mentioned, in 1999, Sky and I started the eCompanies incubator. At that time, venture capital was flowing, the stock market was booming, and we started eCompanies with the ambitious goal of starting 1 new company a month. And by March of 2000, we had successfully started 9 companies and launched them right into the teeth of the coming dot-com crash. Almost 20 years ago today, Sky and I were flying up on a Southwest flight up to San Francisco to close a $25 million round of funding for the incubator with SoftBank. At the time, coincidentally or not, SoftBank was the largest investor and most prolific investor in internet companies. Little did we know on the flight up that the market began a crash that over the next 2 years erased 80% of the value of the NASDAQ, reduced venture funding by 85%, caused the failure of probably 50% of the 10,000 or so online ventures that had been started in the late 90s. When we got to SoftBank, needless to say, we were met in the lobby by a SoftBank executive who explained to us that their largest holding, Yahoo, had just dropped 30% that morning and our deal was off. Sky and I got back on the plane, headed back to LA. And on that flight, we concluded that if SoftBank, the biggest investor of that era, was pulling back, probably every other investor would likely do the same. So on that flight, we decided we had to shut down the incubator. We decided to redistribute the remaining capital that we had in the incubator, which is around $3 to $4 million, to the companies that we thought had the best chance of surviving. And that was Jamdat, Boingo, Business.com, USBX, and Lower My Bills, which we had funded but not founded. Each of the executives in the incubator went to become, who had conceived of the companies, went to become their CEOs. So Sky went in to become CEO of Boingo, Mitch Lasky went in to become CEO of Jamdat, and I took the role as CEO of Business.com. When I arrived at Business.com as a CEO, the company was burning $1 million a month with $4 million left in the bank. We needed to take drastic action. We were expecting, Business.com was expecting to close a large round as well, but of course that now wasn't going to happen. So what we did was prepare what's called a zero-based plan, where we made the critical assumption that there would be no new capital available, that we had to make it to cash flow break even with the cash that we had on hand. And what that did is it forced us to examine the business very closely and really dissect every aspect of the business. And in so doing, we realized that 80% of the activity on Business.com, which was a very ambitious business portal, was on the search and directory portion, but that only really comprised 20% of the cost. Whereas the content side of the business was 80% of the cost, but only 20% of the activity. So that gave us an idea of how we could dramatically reduce costs while maintaining the core of the business. We also realized that the CPM business, of which we were generating millions of dollars of revenue, was rapidly deteriorating and was a very expensive business to maintain because we needed to have external account managers calling on agencies. But we were experimenting at the time with a nascent cost per click business that was a self-serve business. So what we decided to do, and it was a much better fit with the search and directory business. So what we decided to do was eliminate the content business entirely, shift from CPM to cost per click. What that did is allowed us to dramatically reduce our costs while maintaining the core of the business. It also meant a really brutal and painful reduction in staff from 130 to 30 employees. But those moves that we took allowed us to survive. The company within 2 years became profitable. Benchmark and Bill Gurley came in for a growth round in 2004, and we ended up being able to sell the company to Donnelly for $340 million in 2007. Jamdat also survived and then thrived. They went public and were sold to Electronic Arts. And of course, Boingo went public and is still a successful public company, and Lower My Bills was sold to Experian. So that process, basically going through that crisis, we learned a bunch of things. The first thing is you need to be decisive. You need to act quickly. You can't afford to wait. Hope is not really any form of strategy in a situation like that. So what we did is we made this critical assumption that venture capital for the foreseeable future would be very limited. And that then shaped our immediate decisions thereafter. That allowed us to really get to the core of the business and eliminate all ancillary costs that were not related to growing that core business. And so that basically is how we survived, how eCompanies and their portfolio companies and Business.com survived. That zero-based planning process is a process that I've used in other recessions. I've also used it when a company is not succeeding, when it's not hitting its mark, to really reset and start the company from scratch with the available capital. So those are my lessons from the recessions.
Awesome, thanks, Jake. And I think it's also worth noting on your story that the first new capital that came into Business.com was 2004?
Yes.
Yeah, and that was very common. In the case of Intermix, post-crash, it was kind of mid-2003. And that always surprises some people, that dot-com crash, as you know from living through it. I think much like this recession we're about to go into, it just takes longer than people think. And it wasn't
Absolutely.
bounced back in 6 months or 12 months.
Yeah, the window shuts very quickly and takes a really long time to reopen. And it's very important that you don't wait to figure that out, because by the time you figure that out, it's too late. You've burned your cash. So you have to, that's why that zero-based planning is so important. Assume today that there will be no new capital for the foreseeable future and develop a plan around that. That's a critical step that we took that allowed us to survive.
Right, right. Great point. Okay, thank you, Jake. We'll now turn to panelist number 2, Kara Nortman. Kara, as many of you know, is a partner at Upfront Ventures. She began her career at Battery in the late 90s and eventually went on to co-head the M&A group at IAC, parent company of 100 consumer brands, including Match, Ticketmaster, and HSN. Kara led the seed funding at Tinder for Tinder while she was at IAC, and finally she launched her own startup, PSXO. A couple years ago, she serves on 10 boards for Upfront in the enterprise space as well as consumer. I also think she did a fantastic job, if I do say so, co-hosting the Upfront Summit, one of the last big conferences we snuck in under the wire here in Los Angeles at the Rose Bowl this year. Kara did a fantastic job on multiple panels, and really the overall Upfront Summit, I think, was a huge success and a huge light here on Los Angeles tech, which we certainly appreciate. So thank you for doing that, Kara, and fill us in on everything you've learned starting at Battery. Kara.
Thank you, Brett. Thanks for having me. It seems like the Upfront Summit was not 3 months ago, but 30 years ago. So as we say during as my people say during Passover, next year in Jerusalem, next year, hopefully we will all be back together in a real world setting. So I similar to Jake, I was thinking back. I think one of the things generally that's interesting is that there's some of us who've been through these crises, and I've always felt like I'm maybe the youngest old person who lived through the dot-com, because I'm the dot-com bubble bursting and then 08, 09. And I think we all thought we were ready for a downturn and the Black Swan event. And I am going to make some comparisons, but I think one of the things I wanted to say, just to set the context, is this one feels different, I think, to all of us than we could predict. And I think we're all looking for these historical patterns, and a lot of the lessons are universal, but I also think this time around may be a bit different, and there may be more permission on the margins to, kind of use common sense and figure out what feels right to you, because the experts, as we're seeing now, are leading us in a bunch of different directions that change from week to week. But as I was thinking about the different crises, the 2000, 2001 felt more analogous than 08, 09, felt more similar. I think there were some differences. It's interesting to think back. I was a 23-year-old associate at Battery Ventures, sitting in a very dark, cold office off of Route 128 in Boston. Thank goodness I'm staring at sunny, beautiful California now. When I got there in 1999, it was the height of the bubble, and in a lot of ways probably felt the way that the tech world felt, from a fear of missing out and financing and capital being sort of abundant. It felt that way back then too. I would sit in an office and I would take all these magazines, Storage World and PC World and Red Herring, and I would circle names of founders and cold call them and try to convince them I was selling money, try to convince them to take my money. And that was the first year. And I was actually cash and equity comped on finding investments that the partners would do back then. And I found 6 of them in the first year, which meant that when the bubble burst in 2000, I had a lot of people I looked up to saying, you got me into this mess. Now we have to figure out how to get out of it. I think that when I looked back, and I actually, I read some of my old investment memos and just some of the even my business school essays, a lot of what was happening back then was similar. So you had companies that were, funded to go after consumer models, that when, Webband and Pets.com and all of these companies blew up, had to sort of pivot and really figure out where did their technology apply to, a problem that existed right then. The early stage companies, like companies that we helped, or that started or were funded in that time period, those companies had a much easier path than the ones that had to go out and find capital. So during those times, I had everything from a company called Envoy Worldwide, which was the first board seat I was given in 2000 when I was 24 years old, where, you know, we just had to hustle and find money and find it from strategics and give away warrants and cut burn. And the CEO ended up losing and leaving and all of the different things that happened, but ultimately got that company to a place where we could merge it with another one. I was given a company called Metro PCS to babysit, which sounds funny now, but it was in bankruptcy. I mean, babysit really basically just meant reporting. The reason I like to bring Metro PCS up, though, is that when I got back from business school to Battery in 2004, it was then on a path to going public. So it had come out of bankruptcy. It figured out how to hibernate and then come out of it. And then there are companies that, you know, that didn't make it. But you had the whole gamut. And, you know, I kind of tried to boil this down to a few things I could leave you guys with, and I'm happy to go into details around any specific company. The first one really is to use common sense. I think the rules for right now are really being written. It's very different now than then, right? You had 25 million internet users. You had business models that didn't really work. Now you have stuff that works. Tech is not a niche industry. It's a much bigger industry. But I think this time around, we're not going to find permission to do things the right way in a blog. There are certain very sensible things like zero cost budgeting and scenario planning and things that we all need to go through. The flip side is I would trust your common sense more than maybe I have in the past. You know, even if you just look at simple things we're hearing in the world, like don't wear masks, wear masks. I mean, if we use our common sense right now to figure out, is my business working? Can I get enough cash on the balance sheet to, you know, control my destiny or get through this? I think we're more likely to end up with better outcomes. The second is that, I mean, there's more innovation going on in the last few weeks across the world and across our country than I think any of us have seen in a lifetime. If you had told me that entire school districts, tens of millions of kids would go from, would be online educated in a matter of weeks, or that, you know, my local restaurants would turn into to-go bars. It's just, people are breaking rules, and, you know, kind of the regulatory environment is changing. The number of problems out there to solve are changing. The third thing is really pick your partners well. You know, I think you want, you know, this is maybe self-serving for you and me, Brett, but Chuck sent me a note, said, Carrie, you're on 2 panels today. And this is like my big coming out day, coming out of the hole of spending, you know, basically a lot of time in portfolio. The world today is much harder for founders than it is for venture capitalists. But, you know, if you have venture capitalists who care about you getting funded and doing the right thing and making sure syndicates behave, it's been a pretty busy 5 weeks. And, you know, you're going to tell who your good partners are now, and the people who can navigate syndicates and help you get money at reasonable valuations and all of the different things. So, but, you know, be very, very thoughtful about who you're picking and how you choose your partners across the board. And then the final thing, and Jake mentioned this, is scenario planning. I think we're all going through that. Zero cost budgeting is really helpful, particularly if your business model shifted entirely. You know, one of the things we saw in the last downturn, and I'm seeing it now in some of the companies I'm involved with, is you have a certain cost basis for your business, but your revenue may have fallen off 20%, 30%, 100%. And as you're shifting to trying to figure out, do I stop and wait for that model to come back, or am I going to try something completely different? If you move from like where you were down as opposed from zero up, you're much less likely to get to the right cost structure for whatever you're trying to move through. But we also don't really know how the world's going to play out, when we're all going to get back together, what kinds of businesses, like, you know, if you have a business where you gather together in person, like the Wing, which is in my portfolio, we're scenario planning around what happens if, you know, it takes 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. So I think you should look at scenario planning as a forever thing. It needs to live, but give yourself and your team enough time to digest it, to see the way the world's going to play out, and know at what points in times you'll move into the next kind of wing of the decision tree. So I'll take a pause there. And Brett, thanks again for having me.
Dynamite, of course. Yeah, no, I love everything you said, especially the old-fashioned pick your partners wisely. You know, it's one thing in good times, as we all know, financial partners, everybody sort of beats to the same drum. You learn a very different lesson as soon as there's a correction, as soon as there's a downturn. if you chose the correct partner or not. And it may be too late in some cases to be too picky, I will admit, but for ongoing from the entrepreneur's journey, really being thoughtful, to your exact point, on picking that partner for how they react when tough times, really will pay dividends. So that's a great point. All right, we will move on to Chuck Davis, who we now know is the panel police, keeping an eye on who's on what panels across the LA landscape. Chuck is currently the CEO of Prodege. Previously, he was the CEO of Fandango, which he sold to Comcast, and as well as the CEO of Shopzilla, which he sold to EW Scripps. Welcome, my good friend Chuck Davis. Take it over.
Thank you, Brett. I think the first lesson here is there always is the other side of the rainbow. Like being the old timer here with Jake, we've seen a lot of these and we've gotten to the other side of the rainbow. And this is going to reveal us, Jake, as our age. But when we got out of college, interest rates were 20%. And Reagan came in as president. And just like there were the $1,200 handouts or whatever they were, like in the last week, we got a $600 handout twice. And they wanted to make sure it wasn't one check, it was two checks. And I remember we went out for a nice steak dinner and smoked cigars because it was the beginning of the other side of the rainbow. So I will say in each of these I've been through, there has been this other side of the rainbow. And I think that's really important to realize. The 00 crisis was a very unique one because the tech ride-up was just so high that that the story I'm going to say is just kind of odd, but it was true. It was biz rate, and we became Shopzilla, and I joined in December of '99, and in 00, in March, the markets crashed, and somehow we closed a 50 million round at 700 million valuation on 1 million prior year revenues. And, I don't know if that's a blessing or that's a curse because there was just so much money that it doesn't breed good best practices when you have 50 million in the bank. And incidentally, we had an S1 written to go public at $1 billion. So had I filed 2 days earlier, of course we never filed, I would not be on this panel today because my whole trajectory in life would have been very different. But therefore I was in purgatory. So, but in that business, the board finally said, Chuck, you got to cut half the people. And Jake was one of those on that board. And I said, which half? I mean, if you have to cut half, which half? Because if you're going to cut half, you're almost cutting whole because there's not a lot of muscle left. So what I convinced the board to do is let's do it in layers. Let's take out like 15% right now and wait and see. So the first lesson that I would say is none of us really know the depth or the duration of what's going on right now. And in each of these downturns before, they seem to go a long time. We didn't know they were going a long time, but they went like 2 to 3 years, right? Based on the story you just gave, Brett, of how long it took in Kara to open up the markets, and Jake, you said this too, to get more money. So we don't know that. So you could do all the scenario planning you want, but you really do have to learn how to make it work no matter what. We ended up having 5 layoffs in something like 16 to 18 months. And while that was highly traumatic for everyone, it's one reason why we survived and were able to sell to EW Scripps for over $500 million. And the reason was, if you cut out small layers each time, you start seeing where the muscle is and where the fat is. But if you cut all 50% at once, you certainly have cut the burn, but you've probably cut out some key organs also, and maybe you won't survive. So that's one of the key lessons that I got out of this. Another key lesson is at some point you have to play offense, not just defense. And we are very much all working on defense. How are we going to get through this? How are we going to stretch our dollars? How are we going to cut the burn? How are we going to scenario plan? And we do so much of the scenario planning that we forget right in front of our eyes is some new opportunity that is on sale because the whole world is on sale. So let's make sure that we do our defense, but we also look for offense. And the third point that I would make is over communicate. Over communicate with the staff. We've been having in my company right now at Prodege 3 meetings that I do every day. I have the 9 a.m. COVID meeting with the key crew, including HR, like what are we doing and how are we dealing with it? I got the 1 o'clock supply and demand meeting. How are revenues for the last for the last 24 hours? And how are we doing on user acquisition? How are they coming in, free and paid? And are they coordinated? Because if it's going to be a bad revenue week, we probably shouldn't overspend. And then the third meeting I do is called the shareholder meeting at the end of the day every day with the founder, me, and the CFO, making sure that we have done the right thing for the investors, not just the employees, and for our partners. So those, I think, are the key lessons that I would say that I've seen through a lot of these. One example of the offense that worked really well at Fandango when I got there in 07, 08. It was 08, as you know, was another bad year, and people went, record number of people went to the movies in that recession. It kind of turned the company around. And who would have thought? And in 00, even though we were in the recession, 0001, people were so depressed, especially after 9/11, that they didn't go out to malls anymore and they started shopping online. This is what I'm saying. On the other side of the rainbow, there are opportunities. Make sure you keep your eyes open to get them. The Fandango example was a couple engineers were working on a secret project that they told me about, and they couldn't tell me enough of what it was. And it became very evident in the depths later on that it was the first app on the first iPhone. And even the tech guys who were building it didn't know what an iPhone was or what an app was. And nor did I, as CEO, know I'd be on the first iPhone. That changed the whole Fandango business too. I'll end there, Brett. Thank you.
Great. And I see we got 30 plus questions coming in. We will get to them shortly. I love that, Chuck. The number one takeaway to me is there is another side of the rainbow. I know that this is a very unique time, and it's worldwide, and sometimes it's easy to get kind of lost, as you said, in the cuts and the reducing the burn, et cetera. But we certainly, like the other crashes,
Hey, Brett, there are a couple questions here about the cuts, so maybe I should answer that before you move on.
Awesome.
One is, isn't it better to have one deep cut early than doing multiple cuts for morale of the employees? And I'd say yes. I can't tell you that when I did cut number 1 that I knew I'd have a cut 2 through 5. So yes, 1 without cutting organs is pretty good. But my lesson here is, we don't know the duration of this malaise. So yes, the first one is the deepest, but you need to be prepared that there might be more than one. So, and then how do you not cut too many organs? Ironically, when we did that first cut, the first cut that went out in the Shopzilla days were the MBAs. We had a lot of generalists who went out, and the organ keepers were the ones who had vertical expertise in something. And I think it's important that generalists are great, but when the chips are down, having vertical specialists are what's needed to keep the organs flowing.
Awesome, great. Thank you, Chuck, for tackling those questions. All right, moving on to our 4th and final panelist, Sky Dayton. A lot of you know Sky Dayton, 27-year career here in Los Angeles, founding 3 public companies, including Earthlink, Boingo Wireless, and of course, jammed at through the eCompanies stories, and most recently, CloudKitchens. You add it all up, and it's created something like $10 billion in value, primarily here in Los Angeles, which I know we all care near and dear about. So thank you, Sky, for always creating so much value here in sunny Southern California. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Brett, and thanks, Chuck and Jake and Kara. And I got to work with Chuck a little bit at Boingo, which is really great, and with Jake for many, many years. And you know, something that Jake said to me way back, I think he was still at Disney, and and we were talking about this crazy idea of starting an incubator in the late 1990s. And, he said that, we're living in a sort of a golden age that your grandkids will ask you about, and they'll ask you, what did you do during that period? Because they'll be reading about it in school. It'll be like this era that they all learn about, just like the Industrial Revolution. And it would be kind of cool to be able to tell them some great stories, like, this is how I contributed, this is what I did. And it still very much feels like we're in that. And if anything, it's only accelerating. So, my story goes back as a 20-something, early 20s. I guess I'm dating myself here. I discovered the internet in the early 90s for myself. I realized that quickly that it was the next mass medium, and wanted to make it easier for people to connect to. And that was the idea behind Earthlink. In 1993, there were no companies in the United States with the word internet in their names. It was just not really known to anyone. Over the next, couple decades, Earthlink grew, went public. But along the way, and this is sort of a central theme, I think, for me as an entrepreneur, every success I had was a failure at some point. The number of near-death experiences that we had in those early days, pretty incredible. I mean, we tried to take the company public in 1996, and this is, my education in downturns. People don't remember, in 1996, there was like a mini crash, so much so that we were in New York preparing our kickoff of our roadshow, and the bankers came in and said, hey, listen, we got to call this whole IPO off. The problem was that we were out of money. We didn't really know where payroll was going to come from. Fortunately, we raised a kind of emergency round with actually George Soros, and who became our last private investor, took the company public in 1997. We were the only other company to go public in the first quarter of that year. The other one was Amazon. So, that then went, the market went parabolic, the company did, and we drove this thing right into 2000. And by then, Jake and I were working together at eCompanies, and you heard those stories. And sort of along the way, I've sort of picked up this, it's sort of maybe an appropriate word, inoculation to downturns. There are these things that happen, and at eCompanies we had an analogy. It's like you can't really control what the weather or the ocean does, but you're in a boat and you're sailing your boat, and you got to focus on your boat and which direction you're going, how you're harnessing the wind. So kind of the first big lesson for me is, in a downturn or in any market, and frankly, a downturn helps you to do this because it removes distractions, which is focus on the product and the core value proposition of the business and what gives you inherent profitability. The most important thing you can do to control your destiny is to be able to demonstrate that you have something that's needed and wanted, and that will generate free cash flow, even if it doesn't right away. And that's my answer to funding, because, even in a market like this, there's a lot of people with capital that wanted to play it. You can get funded in a downturn, no matter how bad it gets. So, frankly, there are a lot of businesses that have been funded. Unfortunately, it would happen in 2000. It happened in leading up to the 07, 08 period. And it certainly happened leading up to this period that probably shouldn't have gotten funded, that hadn't really isolated that core product market fit, that core underlying profitability. So, that's the thing that I always focus on in any business. And, when Jake and I kind of like took the incubator apart and put all of these incredible people into these businesses, that's what we focused on. At business.com, Jake figured out the formula to not only get users, but bring it to profitability. He had a profitable company, profitable internet company in the early 2000s. This is an incredible feat. At Boingo, I did the same thing. I think that, look, there is something special about these businesses that we are building. We are harnessing underlying trends driven by Moore's law, network effects, and they're, in many ways, they should be immune to macroeconomics. They should be things that are really truly sea changes in consumer behavior. So, some of those might be accelerated, like Chuck's example, in a recession, everybody wants to go to the movies. Maybe not this recession, okay, a little bit different, but, what's going to happen now? Well, telecommuting, here we are doing a conference with, over 100 people and everyone's sitting in their homes. So telework, teleeducation, remote learning, obviously, food delivery, there's just a ton of things that are benefiting from this. That said, the underlying core trends in technology are so powerful that we get, you should be able to push right through this. And if that's not happening, I kind of go, all right, do you have the right business? Do you have the right product? The thing I'll end with is, what specific things do you do? And I won't repeat something that, I think Kara, Jake, and Chuck all said very well around cutting costs and everything like that. But something Chuck said, I'll reiterate, I think is really important, which is over-communicate. I say this whenever a company goes public, you are suddenly competing for your employees, your team's attention with a ticker that's moving, every minute and telling them what their net worth is. Right now, as a CEO of a company, a founder of a company, you're competing with what the headlines are pounding away, and telling your people that the world is a dark place. And that's just not true. This is an incredible time to be building. If you over communicate, and I think Chuck's, words, the other side of the rainbow, are perfect. There is really nothing, there is really nothing new about this. We have lived through pandemics. We have lived through horrible times and wars, and we've always come out the other side stronger. And the businesses that were founded and funded and created and pushed through in those periods become the strongest ones that last, because they were forged in the fire of difficult times. And I would much rather, have a team with me at my side when the bullets are flying, when times are good, who I know when, those good times will eventually end, versus it was all love and roses when we started and they'd never been tested. So I'll leave it at that.
Very well said. Yeah, it's funny. I was going to add to the incredible comments. Obviously, the whole group has come up with that. The number one focus for me always at Intermix or anything else when times were tough was keeping our most talented people on the team and engaged. And as you said, Sky, you do that with clear communication and being honest with exactly where you stand. All right, we've got 37 questions and counting have come in. So I will rattle off a couple that I think apply to most on the panel, and then we can have one or two answers and move on. Obviously, thank you, audience, for submitting. Continue to submit questions, and we'll get to as many as we can in 19 minutes. Question number one, in past recessions, did you ever regret not being more aggressive building your brand awareness at a time when advertising costs have dropped so dramatically? How should today's leaders think about going on offense, investing more, building their brand in this COVID environment? Anyone on the panel can take the lead.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think it's difficult to generically answer that, because it all depends on your ventures financial situation, how much capital you have. I think shoring up the business and making sure that that your burn or profitability is still there is really important. Yes, it's a time to buy customers on the cheap, but it's also a time where if your value proposition is Sky's point of building the right product, if it is truly a beneficial product, your free traffic should be growing right now, because people are stuck indoors and they're on the machine, on the PC more than usual. And I've found that we've been able to do both. We've been able to cut our user ac costs because they've gone down so much. But my free traffic is going through the roof. So again, focus on the product. If the product is working and the P&L is working, then you can focus on the brand piece too.
Good point, Kara.
Yeah, I'll hop in. I mean, I think to Chuck's point, it's the answer to this question is different based on stage and sector, early, late, consumer, enterprise. But one thing I'll say from a number of the consumer companies I work with, so Parachute Home and Skylar and companies like that, I think it's I think one of the things, well, and this is actually true across all of them, I think it's really important to know why you're spending and for what reason, and to recognize just, it's so hard to retrain your muscle away from grow to unit economics and efficient. And I think Sky said this, but at the end of the day, venture capital, private equity, bootstrapping, we all have the same goal. It's just how long does it take to get there, and how open are the markets along the way, which is to have companies that generate cash flow. And there's more tolerance for R&D and creating scalable models where you may invest 10, 20, 30, 50 million in a software company because they will throw off 90% margins and make up for it later. But ultimately, we all have to invest in businesses that make money at some point. And that point has moved up a lot, right? It's moved to a point where it is efficiency and unit economics more than growth. And I think the major thing I've seen across many of the founders I work with is just it takes a little while in certain cases, particularly if your industry wasn't hit right away, to retrain your muscle to like, what do fundamentals look like? And so I think the major thing is not to just spend on brand and tell yourself that's okay without goals. But if you have specific goals, like I am in a company called Skylar that produces clean fragrance. Well, they in 2 weeks spun up clean scented hand sanitizer. And I would encourage them to go spend on that because they're launching a new product and there's a reason for it. But every company is going to be a bit different. And I certainly would be spending if you're seeing a return on that spend and you are seeing cost of acquisition go far down for certain segments, and it is a good time to be spending.
Great. So we can get through a few questions. I'll keep rapid firing. This is a good one. I think is actionable for the conference attendees. What specific tactics can we utilize to maintain company culture? Over communication was mentioned. What else can company CEOs do in a time like this?
I can jump in there. I think along with that goes transparency, just tell them what's happening, and the truth is always much better than the rumor. So, don't let rumors happen inside the company, and over communicate obviously plays into that. I love, Chuck's example, 3 meetings a day. I have a CEO that every morning gets on Zoom with his senior team and sends probably 5 all staff emails a day, and shares customer success. Here's what's happening. So I think that, that kind of visibility is really super helpful.
So just to add to that, I think the over communicating is absolutely important. I think it's important also to not necessarily make that communication happy talk. It needs to be hard talk with a plan. You need to be able to clearly articulate what the risks to survive and thrive coming out the other end, and to have everybody really understand that plan. Matt Coffin had a great saying about it's much harder to take things off it's much harder to take things off a list than to put things on a list. And so part of the over communication is streamline the priorities of the company, explain so everyone in the company understands what's important right now, and keep hammering on that so everyone's pulling in the same direction, because you really have to be efficient and streamlined in a crisis.
Awesome. All right, we'll keep up the pace here. Does anyone have any books that are very helpful to read about previous downturns, or tips that they should be invoking at a time like this?
Yeah, there's a good book from Thomas Friedman, Thank You for Being Late. And his comment was that for the 2008 downturn, some of the best companies like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube started in 06 and 07. And the logic was their timing couldn't have been worse. They started right before a recession. But then all of a sudden the world changed. And this is where my comment earlier about offense, not just defense, they saw an opening and morphed their business plans and put it on steroids. And he lists about 10 tech companies that made that transformation in '08. And that's the title of his book. Thank you for being late.
Right, I'm going to give you a weird response, but I can tell you all the things a venture capitalist should tell you to read. The Accidental Superpower, The Righteous Mind, 15 Traits of a Conscious Leader, all good. But I'm suggesting to people, and I'm doing myself, read fiction. Read fiction with heavy kind of like insightful characters who are thinking about their life, who are going through a crisis, who are going through a divorce, who are realizing something about themselves. It's kind of self-therapy, because I think it's one of these moments in time where we are all seeing the extremes of our strengths and weaknesses. You see it in the people you work with, you see it in yourself, you see it as a parent. And I'm finding that I'm learning more through fiction than nonfiction.
Maybe building on that, it's a little bit, it's not fiction, but it reads like a fiction book, which is, many of you probably have already read, is Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. And what I love about this book is that to me, it encapsulates this idea of somebody maniacally focused on, who absolutely loved and lived their product and made their product the culture of the company. I mean, that is everything. Everybody who works at Nike thinks this way and is just, it's all in on the product. So I think it's a great time to be doing that. And it tells a story of a single founder building through hard times and, you know, what it's like. And there are just many analogs to today.
Awesome. So speaking of books or essays, another question is the Marc Andreessen Time to Build essay hints that we should be focusing on solving real hard problems that push humanity forward. Without sounding condescending, do you think VCs should keep funding somewhat frivolous consumer social apps that really don't subscribe to this manifesto? Any thoughts?
I mean, I guess since Brett, you and I are the frivolous funders as our day job. I mean, I think that essay was a wonderful call to action. I think it's what a lot of us are feeling. I think, you know, Ben Thompson and Stratechery wrote about it today too, and he had a good sort of reduction of it, which is, I don't know that we as venture capitalists fully know how to consistently fund non-software ideas, because they don't line up with this explosive home-run growth. And so part of what Ben said was, how do we think about investing in ways that maybe have more medium run results, or take longer, or take different capital allocations? But you know, I do think it's a good call to action. I don't know that you can bucket, you know, all social apps in a frivolous bucket though. You know, I mean, if you look at the way new social things will emerge now, communities for women, communities for, you know, extroverts isolated at home, whatever it might be, you know, moderated communities, those will become important too. So I think we should spend time thinking about our labels, and we should all be ambitious in what we fund, and fund things that are more in industry, healthcare, food delivery, biotech, ag tech, all of these things that a lot of venture firms have started to do, but hopefully we'll see more and more of that.
Awesome. This is a good one. And with the brain power on this panel, I'm very interested myself. Do you think this Black Swan event will lead to any permanent changes in behavior? Obviously, I think the answer is yes, but I'm very interested to hear from your guys' perspective. What do you feel like the new norm, just at a very high level or specific level for that matter, will look like in society?
The funny thing about new norms is that they become norms, and then we don't talk about them anymore. So, you know, look at the changes post 9/11. You know, we don't, it's an inconvenience, TSA and all the things that we do. There are new norms after the '08 period in banking, and, you know, all kinds of regulations that came into play. So there are probably some things like handshaking that are going to maybe go away. Although my youngest daughter was reading The Odyssey last night, and she turns to me and reads me this scene where one of the characters reaches out his hand to shake the other guy's hand. She said, that was 4,000 years ago. They were shaking hands. So, you know, they'll go away and maybe they'll come back. But to me, I just don't get that focused on it. You know, like, yeah, maybe there are some things like, I mean, there's a question that just came in around, you know, outlook on public entertainment, cinema, concerts, sports. I firmly believe that people will congregate and come together. I don't believe that we will live in a world where you have to be 6 feet apart from someone else. I think as our understanding of this grows and our differentiation, which I think we lack right now, differentiation in our understanding, meaning it's not just a thing that you look at and say it's a percentage. There are all these circumstances. And as we understand that, that grows, that I think we'll find that it's safe and it's fine. And, you know, there will be a lot more hand washing and a lot of things that we already see when we go to, you know, I remember being in Hong Kong last year and they're in the elevator, sanitizing that elevator in the hotel like multiple times a day. That probably happens, you know, and we have things like that, but day-to-day life will go on.
Yeah, I think the whole semi-norm is something that I'm starting to focus on. Like we're probably going to have a year of something before the new norm and after the lockup. And what does that mean in the office? Do I have to survey people and see who is willing to come in if we have proper spacing? And who wants to be on the Monday, Wednesday, every other Friday schedule versus the Tuesday, Thursday, every other Friday schedule? And who just needs to stay home until there's a vaccine? And actually, who's got an office and still wants to keep it and come in every day? So there's so many new interim norms that I think are going to be a flash in the pan that people are going to ask, what were those semi-norms? Because I don't know what real estate's going to look like at the end of this, both commercial and residential. I've got 2 kids in tech working in New York. Are they going to keep taking subways, right? Or is real estate, and how are they going to get into a company? You know, is everyone are they going to line up outside and take everyone's temperature? And they can't have everyone go to the office every day. So I'm very interested in what's going to happen. And I'm an urban studies major. Will this be the de-escalation of urban to more rural and suburban type work-throughs plus more Zoom working for the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Chuck and Sky said. I think one of the things, and we are in the beginning of what feels like a multi-year change, but I also agree we're going to go back to gathering. We're tribal, we're human. One of my side passions is I'm working on bringing a professional women's soccer team to LA. And so, you know, I actually am actively asking these questions. Are people going to go into stadiums again? And, you know, the same fear existed after 9/11. Right? It was large spaces and safety. And I think at the end of the day, you have to sort of, we need a risk reward. We as human beings need the reward of other human beings. And some of the ways we greet each other may change, and it may take a lot longer than we think to get back to normal, whatever normal is. But we need each other. And I think we'll find ways to find each other again in the real world.
One way to look at the crisis is it is a disruptor, a massive disruptor in the way that we work, the way that we learn, the way that we eat. And from that will come massive innovation and opportunity. I think, you know, it is an unprecedented event that will create massive opportunity for either existing companies or new companies to meet those new demands. And a lot of those new demands will stay forever. And some of them will return back to normal, but it is an amazing opportunity to create innovation in new companies right now because of the disruption being caused to the norms of the way we live our lives every day.
Well said. Okay, we'll end on our final question. Can't have a VC conference without talking about valuations. How do you think this virus-led downturn will affect valuations of early stage tech companies or really just of private tech companies in general? Would your answer differ for better or for worse for Los Angeles-based startups?
I'm happy to start. It doesn't differ for Los Angeles-based startups. I think Los Angeles should view itself as a major tech market. In a lot of ways, I I think a lot of the innovation that Jake just mentioned can and will come from Los Angeles. We are more of a microcosm of the country and the world and the industries that can be innovated around than than any of the other tech hubs. So very optimistic for what will come out of Los Angeles. I can tell you just anecdotally what we've been seeing in the market, and a number of the companies I'm involved with were in market when this happened. Seed and early A are very similar. I'd say more disciplined, slower. A lot of kind of, the pure seed firms are talking about, back to holding the line on, if it's an early stage company, 2 on 5, that's back, right? So it's not 3 on 7, it's back to 2 on 5. But at the early stage, before your product market fit, is still largely about the founder. And that's where we're spending more time now, because it is a place where you know how to price. So the $3 or $4 million round versus the $10 million round, unless it has real metrics. And then it's very different across sector and industry. So just as a quick example, I had one company that went to market in the middle of Corona in the security enterprise software space, closed a very large A at a very large post money, as if the world hadn't changed. And I think enterprise software, just as I talk to later stage investors, seems to be slower to have pricing mechanisms work through the system. So that probably will happen, but it'll happen over longer periods of time as earnings are reported and buying slows down. The consumer side, I think, has really been readjusting for 9 months now. And so a lot of the companies that it kind of had largely worked through. And then a lot of what you're seeing is if you had performing companies, but the market, and the market doesn't know how to price, you're pricing with notes so that there's some flexibility to allow founders to go out and then achieve that valuation. But that's more for like the B's and the C's and, the D's, the later stage rounds where people don't really know how to price. So I'd say in consumer, it's lower. In enterprise, it's higher, but later stage investors think it will shift. It's just going to take more time.
Right. Any follow-up thoughts to that?
Well, one of the lessons that we learned in the 2000s about valuation in a crisis is you really got to take the focus off valuation, because the trap that often people get into is they try to maintain a valuation and end up putting PIK dividends on, or multiples, and what ends up happening is your cap table gets completely upside down. Which in a market where there's limited capital, having a complicated cap table makes it that much harder to raise capital. So you really have to relax your expectations on valuation. It's about survival. It's about getting the capital you need. And you might give up a bigger piece of the pie, but if you survive, hopefully that pie will be just that much bigger when the expansion comes.
Well said, Jake. I was more or less going to say the same thing, but you said it much better. That is the end of our virtual conference. I love throwing a conference. I can now say I also love throwing a virtual conference. So I really look forward to doing this. Our amazing panelists, Karen Nortman, Sky Dayton, Jake Winebaum, and of course, Chuck Davis. Thank you all for being here on this Tuesday afternoon. Let's hope that we get through this, and I know we will. To Chuck's point, there is a rainbow on the other side, and I look forward to doing this exact group at some point in the future, possibly in person here in Santa Monica somewhere. Thank you everyone for dialing in today, and we look forward to seeing you on our next Crosscut conversation. Thanks all.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you
for everything that you and Crosscut do for the LA ecosystem. It's awesome.
You got it, buddy. Thank you.
See you guys.